Okay, hello all. Okay, hello all. So we're just going to admit everybody. Okay, hello all and welcome. I'm just waiting for Damian to join us as well, and then we'll get started fairly shortly. I'm just going to mute myself for a moment whilst I'm admitting everyone because it's making that pinging noise. Okay, fantastic. I'm just going to give it a couple more minutes just to wait for others to arrive, and then I'll begin the introductions. Hello, Damian. I see you joined as well. Just whilst we wait for a couple more people to turn up, if everybody could just make sure they have access to the chat and also the Q&A function as well, which we'll be using. I'll be using the chat to post a few links of things such as our website, the YouTube channel, where you'll be able to find the recording of this meeting, and the Q&A in the chat function can be used to ask questions as well. Okay. Ooh, lots of people joining. Fantastic. Okay. Okay then, so I might get started then, if Damian, you're ready as well. What I will do is, yeah, I think we've got a few more people joining, so apologies if you can hear that notification. I thought I had turned it off, but okay. So what we'll do then is I'll get started anyway to give a little bit of an introduction. So welcome to the first of our new Tizard Insights seminar series. This series is designed to share best practice ideas and advancements in the field of intellectual disabilities and autism to a wider audience. My name is Dr. Credwan Evans, and I'm the Programme Director for our Masters in Intellectual Disabilities and Autism that we run here at the Tizard Centre at the University of Kent as well. Today I'll be acting as the facilitator of this talk, so monitoring the chat and relaying any questions back to Damian at the end of his talk as well. He's going to talk for around 40-45 minutes, and then I'll be relaying some questions back afterwards. We also will have James Clodder joining as well, who's supporting from a bit of a tech perspective. So thank you, James. So just a quick note then before we get started, we appreciate that some of the topics today that we might be discussing or that Damian will be discussing may result in some heated debate. So please do keep all comments or questions in the chat respectful to ourselves and other attendees as well. So now on to our speaker. I am more than excited to introduce Dr. Damian Milton, a senior lecturer in intellectual and developmental disabilities here at the Tizard Centre, and also a renowned figure in the field of autism research and advocacy as well. So I'll leave it to Damian to introduce his talk. So without further ado, Damian, I'll hand over to yourself to share your screen as well. Excellent. I'm going to mute myself now.
Thanks, Credwan. My screen slides up. Sorry for the pinging sounds if they come through. Tried to turn off notifications, but it keeps pinging anyway. So
Just to say, Damian, we can definitely see your talk now as well and your slides. Excellent.
Okay. Well, I'll start with this picture here. This photograph was taken quite some years ago now, and this is a photograph of me and my son. And it was a few months after my son was diagnosed as autistic. As you can see, he was very young at that time. And this disabled bay was actually my mother's car, because my mother has physical disabilities for various things. And so I chose this photograph as a kind of the world we were stepping into at that time, that we already knew something about through my mother's experience. But at that time, I was undiagnosed myself. And in this presentation, I'm going to be referring at times to my son's situation through the last 20 or so years. In a kind of general way, just to highlight certain points as I go along. So I'm going to reflect upon how autism and neurodivergence more generally can be reframed using theories such as the double empathy problem and monotropism, and the relevance these have for the inclusion of autistic people in society, and exploring what a neurodiversity-informed and affirming practice might encompass. And the first kind of key concept that I'm going to begin with is going back quite a long way in time to give a very brief overview of this area. In the construction of the norm or normal. And throughout this presentation, a key thread, if you like, is this issue of normality and how neurodiversity, in a sense, bumps up against this term. The word normal and related words came into the English language in around 1840, with the norm having previously meant a carpenter's square. This emergence coincided with the development of the field of statistics, and as Leonard Davis pointed out in some classic work in disability studies, this also had connections in the roots of eugenics. Before the concept of the norm, we had the concepts of the ideal or divine and the grotesque in comparison all too human. By definition, the divine was out of reach for the normal human being to kind of aspire to. But Davis, along with many other scholars in disability studies, argued that disability is not an individual problem per se, but a social, cultural and political category. And Davis emphasizes how disability was somewhat created by the concept of the norm taking hold. And he argued that the concept of the norm and a culture of idealized normalcy creates the problem socially of the disabled person. Without the concept of the norm, disability is not seen in quite the same way as a problem. And the word normal, Davis argued, allowed a shift from idealizing particular bodies to actively wanting to or being pushed to become them. A pressure is exerted to reach or exceed the average. Yet he also pointed out that disability is often left out of discussions regarding social marginalization. Another key influence in this connection between normalcy and disability was one Francis Galton, the cousin of one Charles Darwin, who actually coined the term eugenics and brought in the use of the bell curve in conceptualizing human beings in terms of deviance, error, deficiency, remediation, and correction. And this had a strong influence moving all the way into the 20th century, Sorry for my jump in time there, but in the influence on things like the development of IQ tests and in the development of child psychology and childhood milestones and things like this, with categorization and the growing popularity of eugenicist thought being very widespread in the early 20th century. And this was also followed up by sociological thought of the norm, and especially in terms of dealing with health and illness. One key theorist in this area was the American sociologist Talcott Parsons and the theory of the sick role. Because what Talcott Parsons was arguing was that to be in a position of being sick in society was not just a biological phenomenon, but also a social one, and one took up the position of the role of the sick person, as it were. And with this, you have interaction with doctors being in a position of power and gatekeepers to the role of the sick role. And Parsons saw this as a socially functional role to gatekeep access to this role, with illness and disability seen as a social deviancy from functional norms in the need of professional monitoring and surveillance. Hence the sick note, because you were given legitimate time out of, say, work, your functional roles and norms in society. But there were benefits and obligations which went along with the sick role. Being off work meant you certain benefits, not having to work and things like this, according to Parsons, at least. And so there were certain obligations to this role, one of which was to seek to get better by literally being patient for the doctor's advice. So the term patient kind of literally has that kind of basis in connotation, and to not become a malingerer on the system. So you can see this kind of way of thinking still very prevalent today in how we organize a lot of these things. One quite obvious problem with this theory was the chronically disabled, the long-term sick, and so on, people who were not able to, so as it were, get better and fulfill their functional roles and so on. And a later theorist followed this up with what was called the rehabilitation role, and suggested that the role people should take would be to seek normalcy, basically, to become as functionally normal as possible, putting the onus really on the disabled person to rehabilitate themselves to normalcy as much as possible. At this point, I'm going to take a detour into some of my own personal story with my son. My son's now 23 years old, but before he was even born, in scans when his mother was pregnant, initial worries were highlighted about his brain development, particularly enlargement, ventricular enlargement shown in the scans. So he was already under sort of doctor surveillance and monitoring before he was even born. And when he was born, there was further concerns because he was born with quite an abnormally large head circumference, kind of 100% on the scale kind of thing, if not above it. I did try to point out to the doctors at the time, when I looked at records of myself, that I was had exactly the same head circumference as my son when I was born. So I pity our mothers, but that's the way it went in our family. And in my son's early years, he was in many ways a very bright and sharp little person. And he seemed to pick up very quickly numbers and visual puzzles. So when he was 1 year old, he could count by rote to 20, and he was doing visual puzzles for 3-year-olds, things like this. However, he also had different patterns than what his mother was expecting in terms of reciprocity, things like this. And then he went through a period of somewhat losing some of these skills and tics appearing, things like this. And so a divergent trajectory in development was becoming very obvious very early on when he was young. So my son was diagnosed as autistic when he was 2 years old. And this led to me doing a deep dive researching into autism, as many parents do in this kind of situation. And much of what I was reading, especially personal accounts from autistic people themselves that I began to find, started to relate very strongly to myself and my own development. So that was when I started to self-identify as autistic. And in my son's early years, what we as parents met was everybody and their sort of snake oil salesmen on the internet and so on, promising the earth around what they can do for your autistic child. And so we met firsthand that kind of exploitation of parental fears and anxieties. And part of this comes from the highly medicalized framing of autism in the first place, as a medical condition, because that leads parents to look for medical interventions, treatments, and so on. But autism isn't the kind of thing which is changeable, as it were, to me in that sense. And I know some might disagree on certain points around that in the nuances, but to me it's more a description of a divergent development that's already underway, as it were. And I found a lot of the discourse at that time around things like the window of opportunity to be really quite ableist in orientation. So you have this opportunity to try and alter development to a more normal path, but you must do it as soon as possible in early intervention and so on, which is not a very accepting way of viewing disability in my eyes. And this kind of sets a pathway somewhat to alienation and distress, trying to change the individual in a fairly in a way which is unlikely to lead to much success in that manner. So what did help us as parents was finding those who spoke about autism in a more realistic and humane way. For me, this came largely from other autistic people and accounts and identifying as autistic myself. For my son's mother, it was a somewhat different route, but one of the key people that influenced them and became a friend to our family at that time was Phoebe Caldwell, who's quite a well-known practitioner in intensive interaction in that area. And it was meeting people like this where we could see a complementary way to really the ways we were viewing our son anyway. And so, but finding those supportive voices help oneself in practices one's undertaking. And so the neurodiversity movement and allies to that were personally helpful to me and my family. So what is neurodiversity? It's the diversity of human brains and mind, the infinite variation in neurocognitive functioning within our species. Those who are neurodivergent are those who fall outside of societal norms of neurological development. So neurodivergent, although it's referring to neurology and biology development, is very much a cultural term, talking about social norms and who's deemed to fall outside societal norms of development. So that's a kind of quite a flexible boundary in a sense. With the neurodiversity movement, this is a social justice movement for those seeking the civil rights and societal inclusion for the neurodivergent, not a single group or organisation, and it has no leader per se. It's like most civil rights movements in that sense. So talking to like critics of neurodiversity and so on are often made in very generalized ways, often without referencing even authors within the movement and so on, which I find a bit silly, really. It's like critiquing feminism as if it was one thing. It just doesn't really make much sense. There may be key threads and so on within the movement, but it's a diverse thing by its nature. And perhaps the aspects of neurodiversity which creates the most contention at times is what's often referred to as the neurodiversity paradigm, where variations in neurological development are seen as part of natural diversity rather than something to be purely pathologized using a medical model. And so this is not to say those who identify as neurodivergent do not find life challenging, often quite the opposite. Neurodivergent people are often significantly disadvantaged in many aspects of life. What it is doing, I would say, is drawing heavily upon a social model of disability in terms of how neurodivergence needs to be viewed. So going back to my son's experience and development, we go to school years, and for many this is a highly problematic experience. For me personally, growing up in the 1980s and so on, this was a very problematic experience for me. I would say much has changed over that time, some for the positive for sure, some far less so. I would say a growing problem for neurodivergent people, especially in this country and some others, is highly stringent and disciplinarian school behaviour policies and a growing crisis of exclusion. And so if one looks at the statistics on school exclusions, especially in secondary schools and so It's often neurodivergent or broad ascend issues that come up time and time again. There are, and other minority groups, but neurodivergence is a very strong factor. And I think we're getting a clash between this kind of hyper-normalcy within some secondary school placements and the exclusion of neurodivergent people. For my son, however, this was not the main source of difficulty for my son in terms of services. My son went to a general special school, and then 1 year into secondary, we moved him into an autism specialist school. After a little bit of work with services and so on to do that. Although there were problems with education along the way, mostly we worked pretty hard with schools, try our best, and them as well. However, in our case with my son, the problems came in the shape of what I would call woeful social services, to the extent of mother blame at one point with a particular social worker, and to a lesser extent school transport and CAMS, which also wasn't the best experience I've ever had. And in my own research many years ago and that of others, in family experiences especially, you often get this narrative of fighting battles, going into battle for your child with services. And so the career of many parents, as it were, is you're driven at first down this individualizing medical narrative, but this often quickly changes to one of battling services for needs being met. And the drive towards normalcy and the idealization of normalcy even can lead to quite damaging consequences, even when you have quite good intention. So this is a quote I've used many times from a long time ago now, nearly 30 years ago, from Donna Williams, an autistic writer from that time. I had virtually no socially shared nor consciously intentionally expressed personhood beyond this performance of a non-autistic normality, with which I had neither comprehension, connection, nor identification. This disconnected, constructed facade was accepted by the world around me, when my true and connected self was not. Each spoonful of its acceptance was a shovelful of dirt on the coffin in which my real self was being buried alive. A very powerful and eloquent statement there, looking back at the damage that was done. But a key aspect here for me was I had neither comprehension, connection, nor identification. So they were being rewarded, as it were, for putting on a performance, a mask, but one which they couldn't really comprehend or connect to. They hadn't been given probably a good explanation as to why they were being asked to do these things. These things were being rewarded, whilst if they were being their autistic selves feeling natural, then these behaviors were not being they were probably being sanctioned or so on. And so you get a split sense of self, mental health issues developing as a teenager in this particular case, which Donna Williams wrote quite extensively about. And another key issue, which I've done an awful lot of work on myself over the years is in social interaction and the expectations and assumptions often made around autistic and more broadly neurodivergent people in this respect. These quotes here all come from a study I was involved with many years ago in 2012. And these was consultation data from autistic young people at school. And the average age of these young people was 10 and a half. So many of them were at that point of transition towards secondary school. 95% of people don't understand me. Friends are overwhelming. Adults never leave me alone. And most worryingly of all was adults don't stop bullying me. If you look at these quotes, all of them show a foundational theory of mind, that other people have thoughts that may be quite different from one's own, and being able to predict and navigate on that basis. What they do show for me, compared to potentially your average 10-year-old, is social disjuncture with others, mutual reciprocity problems, boundary setting issues with friends, when is a friend not a friend, and so on. And these quotes to me were evidence of what I frame as the double empathy problem, a case of kind of mutual incomprehension, if you like, where the breakdown in interaction between autistic and non-autistic people are not solely located in the mind of the autistic person, and with theory of autistic mind often leaving a great deal to be desired. It's more a case of two differently disposed people trying to make sense of one another. So this is going to be more likely to be a problem for those one doesn't know well. So a complete stranger is more likely to create some of these issues than someone one has a great deal of familiarity with. Not always, but those kinds of factors are part of it. And the double empathy problem can happen between any two people, but is more likely the greater the difference in one's disposition, whether that be cognitive, perceptual, or whether it be cultural. And these things kind of intersect to create these kind of problems as well. Another key concept for me is an interest model, or what's often called monotropism. And here, one of the starting points is this idea of interest. So what interest perception, what drives us to, in terms of salience, importance in our perceptual capacities? Because attention itself is a scarce resource, and our brains must decide somehow how to use that resource. So as an example, I can flick this pen rather badly at the same time as talking to you, but both of these things become more difficult when I'm trying to do two things at the same time. If someone was to try and throw a ball at my head at this moment in time, I'd be in a lot of trouble, because attending to three things at once is not really going to happen. And so if you imagine sensory filters that may be somewhat differently aligned to the norm, then attention to stimuli in the environment in different contexts may work quite differently. And if you have difficulty filtering out sensory information, for example, then a strategy, even a sometimes conscious strategy, would be to block some of those stimuli out as best one could. And so becoming completely absorbed in an activity, like a flow state kind of way of being, helps one to sensorily block out. Also, stimming. If you're overstressed and have a lack of control around your environment, doing something like this is something I can predict and have control over. It also takes up attention. If I do this or this, it creates more of my attention is taken up from it. So it can be a way of blocking out unwanted or stressful stimuli. There's many uses for stimming, but that's one of them. And these kind of theories came out of autistic accounts, phenomenological kind of grounded theories in many ways. Monotropism came from studies in linguistics originally as one of its main influences. But there's links with these theories and neurocognitive theory that's been appearing over time in relation to neurodiversity. Things like predictive processing theory. With double empathy problem, there's the dialectical misattunement hypothesis, which comes to very similar kind of conclusions, but that coming from a different disciplinary background, as it were. But all of this happens in a social context as well. So experiences of failure, and especially condemnation or mocking of others, can have a devastating impact on what interests are followed through and which are kind of avoided. Can be highly influential in this regard. And to me, this gives some explanation to the kind of spiky profile of interests and abilities often found, especially with autistic people, where the commonality is this spiky profile, but you can have one person who's absolutely loves its favorite activity, the autistic gardener, say. For me, gardening is not my thing, and I'm rather avoidant of it. So complete opposite end of the spectrum there on that interest. But what's common is that spikiness and the kind of intensity of interest and avoidance that you find developing over time. Then going back to personal story again, you have transition to adult services. For me as a parent, this was really quite grueling to go through. Probably the most difficult time of dealing with services, if I had to pick one. With my son's needs often overlooked in meetings for really expedient or fitting into what I would say is a systemic model of care. There was a lack of variety and provision on offer, despite my son gaining full health funding. Supported living, to me, is a great idea, but in practice, it's become a kind of one-size-fits-all model or offer in terms of the type of housing where it's situated. There is a distinct lack of single housing or flats with good noise protection for my son's needs, and this created quite a problem for us. When we finally did find a placement for my son, we really got in there early, setting up contact and family-led training. So my son's mother and I, and within our networks, got in there early on, thankfully with a provider that worked well with us and did a lot of staff training, particularly around my son's needs. It took some time for him to settle in, and there was some bit of bumps along the way. But there's been no breakdown of placement. My son's now been there over 3 years. My son even won an award for the progress he had made in that placement. For me, really getting to the kind of place he needs to be and should be, but it took a while, as I say, for him to settle in. This, for me, was only possible through tenacity, knowledge, and networks of us as parents. I dread to think what situation he'd be in now if it hadn't been for that. So, I get to neurodiversity affirming practice. What does this look like? Well, a couple of years ago, there was a PhD by Charlotte Naylor, an autistic educational psychologist, on this very topic, trying to define it. And they concluded that it was a philosophy of practice rather than a kind of rigid set of actions that could be easily enacted. But there was some common themes to what this practice or philosophy of practice would involve. A culture of acceptance, accepting autistic and neurodivergent ways of being rather than trying to alter that in some way, which links to the main point below. Making help accessible by default. So concepts such as universal design would be complementary with neurodiversity affirming practice, with a desire to reduce minoritization. And perhaps most importantly in my mind, and for the thread of this presentation, is to challenge and expand notions of what constitutes normalcy, and the harms that can come from that, and have a very much more person-centered approach. Epistemic justice, doing with, not to, and cultural sensitivity. Many of these points help to illustrate for me the need for neurodivergent people to lead on things like training and the co-production of practice frameworks. How lived experience of these things are a crucial factor in getting it right. Because many of these things are kind of cultural understandings, and so not easy to implement in practice. It's more of an ongoing effort. How this is not met in practice, though, is quite easy to point out at times. Some traditional behaviour management techniques, among many other strategies for that matter, have often been used in a way that idealises normalcy and individual independence. So even the term independence is an interesting one in the way it's been used over time. Disability activists back in the 1970s used this term widely, but for them it was used in a term similar to autonomy or personal control, agency, self-power. This did not mean having to do everything for oneself with no support from anyone else, for example. A key issue, which I think is going to be coming up more and more in future as well, is things like the values of Wolfensberger type work, normalization thesis, social role valorization, and so on. To me, are not fully in line with neurodiversity affirming practice. And so the value base there is somewhat incompatible for me. You can make a case for this value system being in line with a version of a social model of disability, but to me, there's subtle nuanced issues around normalcy creates a problem when it comes to neurodiversity and complementarity there. Perhaps a more nuanced issue there to consider, but certain things are certainly not meeting neurodiversity affirming practice. Things like making help or access dependent on compliance, things like epistemic injustices, disempowerment of people and people's agency, cultural insensitivity. Unfortunately, this is something I see only too often. One thing that I would suggest avoiding is poo-pooing critique or accounts of harm from interventions and practices, wherever they might be. I see this all too often, and it can be referred to as the no true Scotsman fallacy. So that's not proper PBS because if it's done harm to someone. This is kind of denying the thing that you espouse in any way or can be harmful if it's done properly, type of thing. This is not really a strong argument for me, and it's culturally very insensitive and invalidating to people's experiences. And this goes across many, well, probably all intervention strategies in some respects. People want to defend their practice, and so often that leads to a kind of denial of potential harms. And I think there's also a debate being had at the moment around what positive behavioural support is and what it should be, and the level of disagreement in theory and practice, it would seem. It's not my personal inclination, as it were. Probably well known that I've been critical of these approaches myself. But it's an argument and a debate which is happening within behaviourist circles as well. So is it ABA plus normalisation thesis, and therefore a bit problematic when it comes to neurodiversity affirming? Or is it eclectic and person-centred, and thus not really following the definitions of PBS and things like the UK framework for PBS? And I've seen the term PBS being used to define all kinds of practices out there, because it's become a kind of ubiquitous term in practice, and it's now means, it seems, a lot of different things. Whilst a textbook definition could be quite well defined, in practice I would say it kind of isn't. And it's partly because of some of these debates and controversies, especially around normalcy, the value systems being applied. And of course, one of the key concepts here used a lot is that of social validity. And this can be used in a problematic way if one idealizes normalcy too much in terms of social significance, appropriateness and importance and so forth, of a support strategy being implemented. And one quote I like, this one from Common and Lane, said, "The most frequent method of determining the degree of acceptance for a procedural program has been to ask those receiving, implementing or consenting to a treatment about the opinions of the treatment. This to me makes perfect sense. It's highly person-centered. Great, you know, if the person has agency over what they're consenting to or not. This, though, becomes a significant issue when looking at intervention strategies when they're applied to neurodivergent people, especially those who are non-speaking or significant learning disabilities and so on, about what social validity will look like if we cannot ask the person so directly themselves. And it's often then deferred to, say, parental decisions or key support workers, things like this. And this is where you're quite likely to have a potential clash in beliefs around what's going to be helpful for a person's well-being or not. But that to me leads to the need for humility, for rapport building, relationship building over a long period of time, being highly sensitive to when mistakes are made, being highly sensitive to assent. So if someone's showing you that they don't want something to be happening to them, that you stop, and so on. So taking people's lack of assent very seriously. And so one key document that I worked on partly myself as part of a group, the National Autistic Task Force. And a few years ago, as a group, we put together a guide for quality care in terms of health and social care, primarily. And this was produced in 2019 to create a guide to care for autistic people. It was authored entirely by autistic people, but those who had extensive collective knowledge and experience of social care provision. And especially for those autistic people often who would struggle to advocate in such ways for themselves in sort of written documents and so on. And this guide was written primarily for care providers, commissioners, inspectorates, and so on as the target readership. And we came up with a list of recommendations, which you can see run very much alongside ideas around neurodiversity affirming practice, respecting and promoting autonomy, supporting communication, providing person-centered care, tackling environmental and other stresses, removing barriers to access, fighting stigma and discrimination, recognizing behavior as distress. This wasn't to see all behavior as distress or any sort of challenging so-called behavior as potentially distress, but recognizing the important role distress plays in what's often referred to as challenging behavior. And this kind of related quite strongly to things like a low arousal approach, where stress and distress is a key factor in a lot of these approaches. And these are often seen quite favorably in the autistic community because it's very relevant for sensory overwhelm and unfriendly, stressful environment, as well as staff and double empathy problem type issues, things like this. So it's kind of reframing a lot of these issues from a distress kind of framework. Transitions.
Sorry, Damian. I'll just say we've got 5 minutes left, but we can run a little bit over. I've just posted the link to the YouTube channel in the chat as well.
Okay. I'm nearly there. So, better transitions, and so on. And one key thing which runs through critical disability studies, but also neurodiversity studies and critical autism studies, this kind of work, is challenging normalcy, going all the way back to Leonard Davis's work that I began with. Davis suggested shifting the focus away from those who fall outside the protective aura of normality, as he called it, and instead interrogate normalcy itself. The tools of normalcy, diagnosis, classification, class averages, bureaucracy, and so on. And those who fall outside the protective umbrella can potentially use their intersections to hone these tools for challenging normalcy. So you can see this in autistic and neurodivergent activism, in wider disability activism and politics, and so on. Couple of quick examples. A few years ago, I was involved in a project called the Sensory School Project. This brought together one London borough, particular schools in that borough, a group of researchers, including myself and other autistic people, the families, and so on, and we put together a community of practice largely around sensory needs at school. This very practical ways have had positive impacts on bringing people closer together, better communication between different stakeholders, creative ways to achieve pupil involvement, greater confidence, and so on. And finally, going back to my own personal story, in 2018, I became a father to non-identical twin girls, Meg and Flo. Flo has now also been diagnosed as autistic. And so we're going through the whole process again in many respects, but in a new way, because both my daughters are at mainstream school, things like that. So far, so good though, but I do have quite a lot of anxiety with them getting older and getting towards the transition towards secondary school. As for my son, at the moment, things are going pretty well. So we've got to keep it all going because it's an ongoing process. So there you go. References at the end. Stop sharing.
Excellent. Thank you very, very much, Damian, for that very fascinating and thought-provoking talk as well.
Sorry for going over time.
No, don't worry at all. No, it was. I didn't want you to stop because it was very, incredibly interesting as well, and for sharing your own personal experiences as well. So what I'll do then is, even though we have gone a little bit over time, we will put the recording on YouTube afterwards as well. But do you have 5 minutes for any questions, Damian, or do you need to? Yeah, okay. If anyone does have any questions, please do post in the chat function. I can see lots of people have left but are saying thank you very much as well. I can see some people have kind of said some comments around as kind of a recently identified as autistic social care professional. I'm seeing the same people who are espousing normalization, becoming very uncomfortable with having autistic peers. This has helped me get my head around why that might be instead of taking it personally. So that's a nice reflection there as well. A lot of people are kind of, saying thank you. A really interesting talk as well. Thank you very much, everyone. We also had another person above talk about the double empathy problem. Monotropism was revolutionary for me in understanding myself and how I should work with the people I support. And I now include both in the awareness training I offer to our partners. I'll be looking at the key recommendations you've listed to see how I can use these to ensure our training and work-based learning programs meet this guidance, which is fantastic as well. Excellent. I'll just keep on checking the chat. Okay, brilliant. I think actually I can't see any more questions. People putting their comments about their own experiences, which is lovely to hear as well.
There's something about neurocognitive theory. Trying to think. Some of it's quite complicated work. But there was there's actually on the Tizard archive of seminars, there's a talk by Dimitris Bollis about the misattunement hypothesis in neurocognitive science. That's really interesting work. So, and in terms of predictive processing and that kind of stuff, there's a guy called Joe Beverts who's very good and a bit more understandable. Some of this stuff does get very complex, but
yeah, thank you, Damon. I also see someone actually put a question in the Q&A forum. Thank you, Helen. Helen's question is, how do you think the intersection of autism and chronic illnesses affects this issue?
which issue? Sorry.
Well, I suppose probably the issues discussed, I imagine. If I'm right in my interpretation there, Helen.
It'd kind of complicate all of them. As these things tend to. If you think of double empathy problem, having a chronic illness is going to create interactive and experiential differences and understanding and how that's performed to other people. So things like the performance of pain and illness in a medical context can create a lot of problems because you're not doing it the right way, as it were, so people don't quite believe you and what you're saying. And so I think, yeah, it take me a lot to think about, but there's quite, I think it would complicate all sorts of issues, unfortunately.
Yes. Thank you very much, Damian, for that as well. I've got one more question, if that's okay, so I'll come Catriona. Can you think of any sources that have considered the impact of the double empathy problem on the differences in diagnosis between assigned male/female at birth? Any resources that come to mind?
There probably are some.
Sorry to put you on the spot there, no, not at all.
I mean, there was a collection around sort of transgender issues and so on. Marianthi Corti collection on gender and stuff might be useful and have some connections in it. And yeah, there's some work, but it's kind of emergent. So there's things like PhDs that I've been an external examiner on and things. So a lot of this work's coming through at the moment, I think.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, all sorts of intersectional issues are being explored, I think, at the moment with these kinds of issues, because it's that kind of point in its development, I guess, historically, and how these things go.
Yeah, thank you, Damian. As you can see, Catriona followed up with that they've been struggling to find something. So yeah, that's good. Good to know it's emerging in the field and an area that hopefully will be published around more soon.
Yeah, keep a lookout because things come out all the time in this area, so it's hard to keep track of it all.
Yes, definitely. And also, how many more questions would you like to answer, Damian? I see a few more coming in.
Social communication interventions. I think many of these have been very problematic in the past. So there's been very normalizing in focus. So trying to encourage eye contact and acting normally and so on. I would hope some better ideas are being developed around this, and one interesting one is social stories as a support strategy, because it was the original intent by the person who came up with them was more nuanced as a way of exploring a context and a phenomenon from different perspectives. So more complementary to sort of double empathy type issues. But how it ended up being used in practice was kind of what you're doing is wrong, and what we would like you to be doing is doing this instead, kind of thing. And so quite sort of disciplinarian in a sense, or trying to instill something in the person as a way of doing things. So I think sometimes you have good intentions with strategies which, when they go into different practice settings, get simplified and sort of mold into something else. And I think that's one of the problems with the power of the norm and ableism, and being a very unconscious kind of thing for a lot of people, and how that kind of those micro level things can exclude and so on. It's very difficult to deal with. But then a more open culture that's open to learning, reflection, is more humble in, and that's why, for me, say the girls' primary school, my daughters, not perfect, and there's a lot of pressures on the school, but generally we're all trying our best to work together with what we have and the context we've got. My anxieties are much more around mainstream secondary, because I think partly it wasn't a major problem for my son because he went to special schools. And so certain environments are more affirming and accepting, basically because they're not driving towards normalcy so much. So the more I look into this topic, the more normalcy is part of the big part of the problem. But it's such a hard thing to decenter. But things like the double empathy problem do decenter normalcy as the ideal. And I think concepts and ideas that do that kind of help create ways of working which are more flexible in a sense, and more pleasant for people.
Thank you very much, Damian, because that's actually, yeah, really nice response there as well. I do have one more question, if that's okay, and then we'll probably
There's
try and wrap it up.
message from Katie there in the chat about their chapter in the double empathy reader. Very good. That's a good resource to look at trans and gender diverse experiences. So as I say, this work is emerging, and thankfully we've got some of the people in the chat. So
yes, definitely. Damian, I've also got one actually in the Q&A forum part from Bihan or Pani Bihan. And the question is, how do you think the PBS field can acknowledge and take responsibility for the distress autistic people have experienced from poor or harmful implementations without dismissing those experiences as not real PBS, and while still holding practitioners and systems accountable?
That's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. Thank you, Paddy.
I mean, I think it's very hard for individuals and historical issues, but I think being far more upfront to potential harms or accounts of harm, not brushing things off as just anecdotal evidence or this kind of thing. Because for me, yes, anecdotal evidence of positives of an intervention needs to be taken very skeptically. So, oh, this was great for me, kind of thing. But accounts of harm, I think, need to be taken very seriously ethically, and not be dismissed and be looked into. You may find that there's not a huge amount of content to a complaint, say, but you've got to trust that and work with people and not dismiss them. So one thing that springs to mind is big on social media at the moment is a safeguarding review of Mossbourne Academy School in Hackney, I think it is, which is well known for a zero tolerance kind of policies and things like this. But it's been highly criticised in a safeguarding review, despite getting high standards in exam results, things like that. And complaints have been made and protests about behaviour policies being too strict and things, and negative impact on SEND pupils, all of this. And it's kicked up a whole huge kind of educational ideology debate on social media. You've got the behaviour ambassador, Tom Bennett guy, dismissing the report and critiquing the review and things. And to me, this kind of shows a cultural insensitivity to the complaints that have been brought forward, the negative experiences of pupils, of staff, of parents. It's like, and to me, it seems ideology at times is trumping that kind of working with things, even if it's very uncomfortable. So it's acknowledging harms occur in all fields of care and support. And despite, even with following protocols, following things exactly, ticking every box, you still potentially can harm people unintentionally. So it's, yeah, taking these things much more seriously and openly, I think, is would be a good start. And some people do. I'm not saying everyone blocks this off, but I just think that kind of thing shows willingness.
Thank you very much, Damian, because that's some great take-home messages for those working in the field as well. Yes. So would you like to, should we start, kind of close it off there then?
Yeah, I guess I've taken enough of people's time.
Yeah. Oh no, not at all. Thank you very much, Damian, because that was, yeah, we're all very grateful for you giving us your time as well. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining, and thank you massively to Damian for your very insightful talk as well. But like I said, the recording will be on the YouTube page, and please stay in touch for our future Tizard Insights seminar series talks as well. So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Damian. Thank you.
Thank you.
And goodbye. I hope everyone has a lovely festive period.
Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I'll end the event now. Goodbye, everyone.